Thank you, Your Excellencies.
Thank you.
And thank you, Terra Pomaria, for having me. I'm very excited to be teaching this. I don't get down your way too often, unfortunately. I live in Terra, and with the borders being closed now, it's difficult. But I'm very glad to be here this evening. I'm Wulfstan Meistari Hrafnsson. I am the baby laurel of Ontier, which is to say I'm new. I wasn't elevated for babies. I do have 4 children, but nonetheless, I am the newest laurel in our kingdom. I was elevated right before the pandemic lockdown. Thank you. At Kingdom Arts and Sciences in March. Okay, so this is the Ontier A&S and Bardic judging forms. We use these forms at Kingdom Arts and Sciences for Arts and Sciences and Bardic entries. I entered and won Kingdom Bardic a couple of years ago. I actually was a bit of an oddity in that I did 3 Bardic entries for Arts and Sciences. I entered the year we had just changed the rules. The projects I wanted to do worked better as Arts and Sciences pieces rather than at Kingdom Bardic. And so I proceeded with those projects and changed from entering Kingdom Bardic to entering A&S. And I happened to win. So that was fun. And these are the forms that are used there. They're also used in my own principality in Terra. I'm the A&S minister for Terra. And we use these forms for our Arts and Sciences and Bardic championships. And the barony of Lionsgate also uses them, as well as other baronies and branches. And a few kingdoms elsewhere in the known world have used our forms or a variant of our forms as well. All right, so here is a little bit about me. I am, as I said, Wulfstan Hrafnsson. I'm a herald. I do Shakespeare. I marshal. I do some archery. I fight heavy a little bit. And I'm mostly known for my research and for Bardic arts, the Norse poetry and that kind of thing. About the forms, I should say, first of all, that this class is essentially the warranting process for judging at Ontier Arts and Sciences Championship, as well as for Terra Arts and Sciences and other competitions that use these forms. So once you have taken this class, you are considered qualified to judge at those events. And you will be asked before you do, if you have taken the class, and you'll be able to say, yes, you have. And that you can go on from there. We do still often have people student judge if they haven't judged before. It's a really good experience. But going through this class will give you a sense of how to use the forms, and you'll be considered able to do that for the competition. So the first thing on these forms became when we wrote the forms. I was on the committee that drafted the Bardic forms originally, 6 or 7 years ago now. And we came at it from a particular design philosophy, which was quite different from the old forms. I don't know if any of you had judged or competed with the old A&S forms before. I did my 2 Terra Bardic championships on the old forms, and they were different. They were a lot harder to figure out what exactly was being looked for as a competitor. And they were also harder to use as a judge. And so we wanted to fix some of the things that were not really what we wanted and make some things easier that were difficult. So the first thing is we felt that assessment tools have to balance the requirements of the competition on the one hand and the needs of the competitors on the other hand. And those are quite different things in some ways. Primarily, the competition needs numeric scoring because that allows us to judge very different entries fairly. We can put a score on this one and a score on this one and compare the scores, because otherwise, if you're comparing a research paper and a doublet and a song, it's very hard to compare them unless you can really quantify and make it more concrete. That goes along with the need for robust, comprehensive, and equitable assessment. So it needs to be able to survive all 3 of those kinds of things and also different kinds of projects. It needs to be comprehensive and be able to either be used for any project someone might bring or be adaptable to be used for anything someone might bring. So in the last year, we introduced an experimental archaeology form. which was being asked for a few years because the best one we had prior to that was the A&S process form, which didn't quite work. So we went on and created that new form. And the nice thing about that is we can take the principles of the forms and the format of these forms, these rubrics, and we can expand them where there are gaps. The assessment also has to be equitable. So when we're judging a song and a research paper and a doublet, we need to be able to compare them in ways that make them not the same, but equal, and to be fair to all the projects and all the competitors. Because otherwise, if the form skews one way or another way, it makes it unfair for competition, and that's no fun. And the competition also requires clear tools, which are easy to use with minimal training. This class basically is the training that we do. And I've done this in a 1 to 2 hour format like this, whether in person or online. And I've also done it in as little as 20 minutes before the competition started, because we just needed to get people a general sense of how to use them and get into the competition. So they need to be easy to use, and that's very important. It's often hard finding judges for these competitions, and we want to make them accessible to people who are willing to help. And so with that, it needs to not be something that requires hours and hours of training. And it also needs to not be something you need to have known about for several years. You need to be able to volunteer and be trained up really quickly and be ready to go. So those are the competition requirements. Competitors' needs are a little bit different. The competitors need clear parameters and expectations. They need to know what the judges are looking for. They need to know what a 5 looks like. They need to know what a 2 looks like. They need to know what kind of presentation, what kind of project, what kind of things they need to focus on in their presentation and in their project. So they need those really clear expectations. They need to have a sense of fairness. It only needs to be fair, but the competitors need to feel that it's fair. It needs to be obvious that their doublet or in somebody else's tunic and somebody else's research paper and somebody else's song are all being judged equitably. There have been an impression previously, and this is why I was a bit of an oddity. People didn't win A&S with Bardic entries, and that people didn't win A&S with research papers. And there was a lot of excitement the year that I competed, because the 2 finalists on Sunday morning were myself with 3 Bardic entries and Lady Maud, who had 3 research papers. So it was a bit of an unusual competition that year. It was really interesting and fun. Competitors also need really clear, constructive, and effective feedback. And I really can't stress that enough. I'm a teacher in modern life. I teach high school history and English. Students really need feedback if they're to improve. And the thing we want to have happen with our competitions is not just to choose a champion. We want it to be a learning experience and a growing experience, and a positive experience people want to come back to. So we want to make sure that it's effective feedback that people can take and look at and grow from. And so it needs to be clear and constructive as well. I have actually had occasion to sit with people after a competition, go over their forms with them and talk with them about it. And when we used older forms, I know on one occasion I was sitting with a competitor afterwards. They had not gotten very constructive feedback. It didn't seem consistent with the numeric scores. It wasn't very clear or detailed. It really didn't give them very much, and it really created a bit of a negative experience. And that was somebody who won that competition. So there wasn't somebody who did badly. This is somebody who actually won, and still their feedback didn't feel like it was in keeping with the scores, and was confusing and unhelpful. So we really wanted to make sure that these new forms were better about that and gave opportunities for judges to give really good feedback. And as I mentioned, the consistency between verbal feedback and numeric scores was not always present in the old forms, and we really wanted that to be the case with these new ones. We also felt the assessment tools have to provide a fair and accurate evaluation of performance while supporting a positive experience for all competitors, whether they do really well or don't do so well. It needs to be a positive experience for everyone. And the judges also need to be able to complete the form in a short time frame. Typically, competitors will have about half an hour to 45 minutes with their judges for both their presentation and for their questions, and to go through documentation and the whole works. And then the judges have about the same time afterwards to look over the piece, to discuss it, to go through the form and apply their scores. And that's not a lot of time sometimes. There's often a lot of discussion. And so it needs to be really easy to use so that they can get a lot done in a fairly short time. Specific positive feedback is more constructive and feels more encouraging, even if it's critical. So rather than allowing people to be vague, these forms specifically focus on specific feedback and positive feedback. And we'll see how that works in a few minutes. But that's a really important key to the design philosophy in these rubrics. It is also the case that feedback on low scores especially needs to be consistent. So if somebody got a 2 rather than a 5, it needs to indicate why that was, but still has to be encouraging and focus on what is there rather than what is missing. So we will tend to say, you did this part really well, rather than saying, well, I wanted to see this and this and this and this and this. You did this really well. What I would like to see more of is, and then some details there. By and large, scoring which errs in the favor of the entrant is more supportive. So when I'm using similar rubrics at school, for example, my students, if I can't decide if a student's essay should get a 3 or a 4 for their maybe their remainder themes, then I will tend to say it's probably the 4. If I can't decide, I might go 3.5, but it's probably the 4. And likewise, we don't use half marks in these forms, but likewise, we encourage our judges, if you can't decide if it's a 3 or a 4, it's okay to give them the 4. You know, this is not meant to be a punitive exercise. This is meant to be an encouraging exercise. And there are some ways to create the effective half marks with your group of judges, but basically we want to err on the side of encouraging and supporting the entrant rather than criticizing. We also wanted the forms to be scalable so they could be used at different levels. We use these forms, as I said, for Ontario A&S, for Principality A&S, certainly in Terra. I'm not sure if Summits uses it as well, but they certainly can. And for Lionsgate and other baronial and even Shire competitions. And those are different competitions. I've been my Shire's Bardic champion. I've been my Principality Bardic champion. I've been Ontario's A&S champion. And they're very different experiences with different needs and different expectations. And they're supposed to be. So what we want to have is a form which can accommodate for somebody who's brand new and entering their baronial championship for the first time. And which can also accommodate for somebody who's a Laurel and has entered Kingdom A&S 3 or 4 times and is entering again and has a lot of experience. And they should be able to use the same form and be judged on that in a scalable way. The feedback also needs to be efficient in the use of schedule time. So as I said, the judges only have a certain amount of time, both with the entrant and in the judging room, to fill out these forms. And so the way they do feedback needs to be really time efficient and aware of that.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
The feedback for low scores is supposed to be positive and focusing on what is there rather than what's missing. How is it constructive for somebody who really wants to know what their next step is to move their work up to the next level?
Well, it could be that too. I don't mean that we should not indicate what's missing. As I said, but rather than focusing on, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that and you didn't do the other, we would say, I really like this part. What I would like to see more of is, and so it's more the way that it's phrased rather than not saying what's missing, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Of course, yeah. And we'll see when we look at the forums in a minute or two. what the actual wording on the form looks like. And there's a way we train our judges too, which I'll discuss a little bit later, in terms of how to word their critique and their assessment, and how to give feedback, which is encouraging and supportive while still being clear about what is and isn't there. Just looking at the chat questions. Did you properly document the steps taken in creation of the children? No comment. Yes, Duchess Eleanor said the summits use these forms for Principality Championship in 2020. It's great. Terry's used it in the last couple of years as well, and it's been fantastic. It's much easier for our judging. Question from Fjorleaf. Being able to give a specific feedback on an entry in addition to filling out the multi-page forms in the time usually allotted for judges to fill out the forms is very difficult. Yes, it is indeed. And that's part of why the forms are set up the way they are now, because they build in a certain amount. It is often very difficult to get everything done with specific feedback in the time we have, which is why the forms have a certain amount of built-in feedback, as we'll see in a minute or two. And we also encourage judges to include their email address so that competitors who have further questions can get in touch with them. And we encourage our competitors to reach out to the judges and discuss further with them. If you're wondering where to find the judging forms, they are at the website that is indicated here. It's arts.ontario.org/forms/judging forms. Don't worry about signing anything. And it's in the chat and will be in the YouTube links when we post. So this is the page that link takes you to. And this is the Kingdom Judging Forms, Arts and Sciences Judging Forms page. There's a primer on the philosophy and using them, which we're going through a lot of that right now. And then there's the actual forms. As you will see, there's quite a lot of them. For the general arts and sciences, there's an object. So if you're making a thing, you would tend to use that form. There's process. So if you're documenting how you make a thing, you would tend to use that form. Experimental archaeology. If you're trying to figure out how people in period made a thing or did a thing, that's probably the one. That's the new one. Research paper for research papers. And then there are 7 bardic judging forms. So there's dance, musical performance, where the performance itself is the focus. Spoken word performance, again, the performance itself is the focus. That's for things like poems, like storytelling, like drama. Visual performance is juggling, tumbling, that sort of thing. Things which are not dance, but which are not necessarily music and are not spoken word. Original music, if you've written a song or a piece of music and are performing it, that is this form here. Original spoken word, if the poem or story is your own work rather than a period work and you're performing it, that's that form there. And then 2 fairly new ones in that we didn't do these really before, pure composition for music and spoken word. So previously, if you wanted to enter a piece of music which you had written or a poem you had written, you had to perform it as well. But with these forms, it allows for people who might be very anxious, might have really bad stage fright, or might just not think they're very good performers, but might be really good composers, might be really good poets, might be really good dramatists, that they can actually enter these because they can use these pure composition forms. So when I did Ontario A&S a couple of years ago, almost 3 years ago now, I did 3 different areas. I did the musical performance form. I led a consort of 5 voices in Robert Parsons' Ave Maria from the 1500s. I did an original spoken word. I did a spoken word performance, that's right, of Shakespeare's Henry V, the St. Crispin's Day speech in original pronunciation. And I did a pure composition spoken word on a Drottfet thing. Drottfet Drapa, a long poem of about 140 lines. And I was very happy to write that, but I didn't want to memorize it and have to perform it. So, so I used the pure composition form for that one. So we're going to take a look at one of these forms. Does anyone have a preference? What would they like to see particularly?
Object would probably be the most common one, I would think.
Yeah, sure. It is a fairly common. Let's do that. That'll work well. So at the top of each one, you'll see there's the Kingdom Art and Sciences Championship letterhead there, and it says which form it is, judging form objects. The neat thing with this too is because we have so many forms, each competitor can choose for each project which form they want to use. So I could have chosen to do my Drapa as a performance, but I didn't want to. So I had this other choice as well. So the entrant will fill in their name, the entry, their branch, probably the date. We discourage them from filling in the score ahead of time. We really prefer to leave that for later. And the judge to fill in their name and their email address right at the top, so it's easy to find. How we have the judges do this is, as it says here, for each question, there's a highlighter to mark the terms that apply to the artist, or to the entry, really. And then circle the box in each row that indicates the point value they wish to assign. So they don't circle the number itself, they'll circle the phrases. And we ask not to use half points. To discourage half points, we round them down. So it doesn't pay to use half points. If you want to give a half mark, just give them the next higher mark instead. So each section has a header and a description of what it means, what we're looking for. And then there's several questions under each section. They're all numbered. There's 20 questions on each form. Each one is out of 5 marks for a total of 100 marks. So no matter which kind of entry you're doing, it will always be marked out of 100, and it makes it easy to compare. So if we look at the first question here, and right now, if you want to read it, and I'll take breaks so you can sign it. So the first question is, how well is the period appropriate aesthetic expressed in the object created? So this is for historical accuracy and authenticity. Accuracy, how much like a period object of this kind is it? Authenticity, how much is the audience's or the viewers' experience of it authentic, or does it feel real to how a period person would have interacted with this thing? So you'll notice the first thing is no attempt made. Oops. Right. So if I were going to, if it weren't at all period aesthetic, I would highlight no attempt made and also circle that. That's the only way to get a 0 on these forms, is if it doesn't apply at all, which means that the judging already favors the entrant because they are very likely to get some points on everything. Moves us away from the idea of zeros. Even a 1, if the object is fully modern in appearance, that's still a 1. The 2 is some effort was made to make the object look historical, but it's mostly a modern appearance. 3 is roughly equal blend of modern and historical aesthetic. 4 is slightly modern, but mostly historical. And 5 is the object is historically accurate in aesthetic and appearance to all but the most rigorous of inspections. So this is something which looks completely period to the judges. Now, in the old forms, there was a section for bonus points, and judges could award bonus points at the end and didn't have to explain really why, which meant that sometimes we would have museum quality pieces that would get 2 bonus points, and sometimes a judge would give 10 bonus points and say, I really appreciated the color photos in your documentation. So for consistency, it was a little bit crazy. What we do now, instead of real bonus points, is it is possible to get 6 out of 5. That's the bonus category on the far right here. And that's the above and beyond. That's even more than we're expecting. Where the object could be perfectly at home in a museum, or it could have come out of an archaeological dig. If we can't tell the difference between the object made for the competition and an actual object of its kind from period, then we're looking at a 6. So what we do as a judge is, let us suppose they've made some effort to make it look historical, but it's mostly modern. That would tend to be a 2, but perhaps we would appreciate it's moving towards fully authentic. It's maybe between a 2 and a 3. What I would do there is I would highlight the descriptors of 2, I would highlight just the phrase moving towards fully authentic, and I would decide what number to give it. And because we're not working alone on these forms, there's always 3 people on a judging panel, and there's sometimes a student judge as well. The student judge's marks don't count, but they can give feedback, and they're part of the discussion. So they do take part, and their ideas influence the marking, even though the scores they give don't. So what we can do sometimes is, if we're not sure if it should be a 2, but it's not quite a 3 either, is often what will happen is that 2 judges will give a 2 and 1 judge will give a 3. And so that entrant gets 7 of those marks out of the possible 15, which ends up between a 2 and a 3. It's not quite the full 9 of all 3 giving 3s, but nor is it the 6 of all 3 giving 2s. And so it averages out between them. And then we highlight, as I said, the phrases we wanted to give, as that provides some feedback, and then we circle the whole section of the score we're giving. We ask judges not to tally in the margins, because we have scorekeepers who do that at the end of the competition, and they double mark. So if there's tallies in the margin already, they think it's been done once already, and it may not be counted twice, and we need that as a safeguard. Okay, so as I said, judges highlight the relevant phrases and circle the assigned scores cell in the matrix. I talked about erring in the entrant's favor and not awarding half points. And really important is working with your panel. Part of the reason we have 3 people is so no one person's voice carries the decision. And we look for consensus, because that also helps give a sense of consistency. Often, if Ragna and I and Thane Clovis are working on a judging panel, each of us often is on other panels as well the same day. And so by working with our panels, it allows us to judge each entrant more fairly and consistently. How we do that is that individual scores on a question should be no more than 1 point apart. Judges are expected to talk about their scoring and have a general sense of where they as a group fall on that. So if some give a 3 and some give a 4, or some give a 2 and some give a 3, that's okay. But if one gives a 1 and one gives a 5, that's a problem, because that entrant will look at that later and say, well, these people all saw my work, they talked about it, why are they so far apart on their judging and their assessment? And that creates confusion and negative experience. Total scores on the entire sheet out of 100 should not be more than about 5 points apart. That's a little less of a hard and fast rule, but we want them to be pretty close, again, for the sense of consistency. If 2 judges give 1 score, like 2 give a 2, like in my example, and the third gives another score, like a 3, that's a good way to give the effective half points, as we discussed. But they really need to be close together. And we do actually recall panels to reevaluate their scores if there's too much difference in the scoring. I've had that from both sides. I've had, as Terra A&S minister, I've had to call back panels and say, we need you to look at this again, because your scores on these 3 questions were 2 or 3 points apart. Or I've also been on panels where we didn't have a close enough scoring. And so we were asked to look at a couple of questions again. It's almost never looking at the whole form. It's usually take 5 minutes, look at these 2 questions, and see if you can meet in the middle somewhere. Can you enter an object that is not physically present? Buildings or ships that are just too big to relocate to the event venue. If you've entered an object, it's something you've made, possibly. I would say in that sort of a case, you would want to speak to the A&S minister, which is Mistress Gala at the moment. But whoever is running that competition at that time, you would need to talk to them about it. Usually we expect to see the thing itself there. There might be ways of doing like scaled models of things, but of course it's a slightly different experience too. I've never seen it done, but in theory you could. It might be better to enter that as a process and talk about how it was made, unless the judges can actually physically interact with it. But if you had permission from the A&S minister and the Crown, there's not a specific reason that I'm aware of why you couldn't. It would add complication. Like if I live in Lionsdale, and if I were, say, in Wastekeep for a competition, I wouldn't probably want to do that because it's so far away. But if you are in your home branch and there are a way for the judges to go out to see the thing that you weren't able to physically bring, that could be a way to do it. Did that answer that question?
Yep.
Wait, perfect. Duchess Eleanor asks, could you speak more to when to choose a process and when to choose an object? For me, this is really about your priorities and how you feel your work is best represented. So if you want the judges to look at the thing itself and how well made it is and how much like the period example, if there's one, it is, and the physical actual object is the important part, then I would suggest an object, use the exact form. If you want to talk about how you made it, particularly for a lot of chemical or agricultural or other processes involved, if it's the making of the thing and your research and your skill in creating and recreating that process is your priority, then I would say use the process form. Sometimes it's also a question of what you were able to do materially with this. For many of us in the SCA, finances are an issue. I think for many of us in life, finances are an issue. And if that is the case, sometimes that affects what we can do in our arts and sciences. And so as an example, and I've talked to him about this, so he won't mind, one of my students entering Lionsgate A&S a few years ago was doing some research on a bridle. And it was before we had the experimental archaeology form, or he probably should have used that one. But he had found a series of articles that had taken the brass fittings from a bridle that had been excavated. I think it was a Viking Age bridle, and maybe even a little bit later. But anyway, only the metal parts were left. Then the leather, of course, had survived. And different scholars had constructed it different ways. So the archaeologist who initially dug it up reconstructed it in one way and published that. And then someone looking at it later, another archaeologist, said, I don't think this is right, and reconstructed it a different way based on visual evidence, illuminations and embroidery and tapestry, that kind of thing. So artwork from the period, said, I think this should work this way instead. And then an equestrian person who was not an archaeological scholar, not a professional anyway, said, that doesn't look right. I don't think that would go on a horse properly, and reconstructed it in a third way. So my student James said, I want to see which of these has the most merit. And so he actually rebuilt it. Now, because money was a problem, he wasn't able, didn't have the money or at that point the skills to make cast bronze fittings and that sort of thing and make them very, very fancy and copy the ones in the that were initially excavated. But that didn't matter for his project. He was interested in seeing which of these three was right. So he cut pieces of brass and in the right shapes and sizes that would fit in the right way and could have leather attached to them in the different ways. And he cut some leather strapping and he built the bridle, and he did it in all three different ways. And the first way he tried, the original way, it wouldn't even go on his horse's head. It wouldn't fit at all. The second way, he put it on his horse, but the horse didn't like it. It was obviously uncomfortable. And he'd been riding for about 5 minutes, and he could tell by the way the horse was reacting that this was not going to work. And he was concerned it was actually going to cause harm to his horse if he left it on any longer. So the first two ways were just out. The third way, the equestrian had suggested, he rebuilt it, he put it on his horse, and the horse didn't even notice it was there at first. In fact, it wasn't until the horse, was there riding, tossed his head a little bit and heard the jingling noise of the metal, and obviously enjoyed that, because as James was riding, the horse was tossing his head a lot to hear the jingling again. So not only was it comfortable and safe for the horse, but it was actually an enjoyable experience for the horse to have this third bridle on.
Sounds like the horse could have done a bardic performance.
Yeah, I think so, actually. If you had met that horse, that's probably accurate. Wulfstan was a good horse. So James figured that out. And it was the process that he was looking at. But he had entered it as the object form. And so because he didn't have pieces that looked like the original ones, because he had pieces that didn't look very fancy, it was a very utilitarian, simple, but functional piece, he lost marks on a lot of the artistry parts, because that was the priority of that form, even though that wasn't the priority of his project. And so that kind of highlights for me the differences. So if it's about the thing being pretty, definitely use the object. If it's about how you got there and how you made the thing, process probably. And if it's about like what James did, and experimenting and seeing, so how did this actually go together? How did medievals actually use this piece? Then probably experimental archaeology is even a better way to do that. I actually chaired that panel as well, so I know that form pretty well.
How do you take into account that your judges may have a greater or lesser subject matter expertise?
I think I know what you're getting at, but can you clarify that a little?
Well, one of the questions, like the very first one, was like, does it have a more period or modern aesthetic? And if, say, you're doing a project that is in one of the less well-explored areas,
Sure.
You may not get judges who are experts on that craft in that culture. And so how do you prevent the judge dinging it because, well, that doesn't look Carolingian to me? And you're like, well, it's not supposed to be Carolingian. It's supposed to be Mansi, which is a completely different culture.
Yeah. Part of it is in judge selection, actually. So the A&S minister will put out a call for judges several months in advance, really as soon as we have all the pieces in. So I think the usual deadline for pieces is by 12th night for Kingdom A&S, and the competition's in early March. So about 8 weeks in advance. Often the A&S minister is looking for judges ahead of time, as he or she knows what is likely to be coming in, because many entrants will have declared their intentions, well ahead of that deadline. I think I declared in December when I entered, for example. Also, the A&S minister, the deputy at that point was my Laurel. So I was in pretty good touch with the A&S minister too. But so as it becomes clear what entries are coming in, the A&S minister will gather judges, and there's a survey which is used at Kingdom, certainly, which people are able to say, here's what I'm really expert in, here's what I feel comfortable with judging, here are things I don't feel comfortable with judging. So there's a certain amount of reflection and self-awareness on the judge's part is expected. And also the A&S minister in knowing who is out there. And it's one of the qualifications for being A&S minister really is having that kind of connection to the A&S community. And so typically the people we get in that role know who's who and who can be relied on for different sorts of things. You do occasionally get things where there isn't really an expert in that area. My Laurel, Mistress Gala, when she did Kingdom Bardic, did Kulning and Yoik and Swedish cow calling, Kulning, and other Swedish poetry and things which are not really well known or well studied in Ontario. And she did some work on some Sami culture stuff, which she's one of the leading experts in the world about it. In fact, Sami people ask her to teach stuff to them about their culture, because they're the indigenous people of Finland, and it's so there is sometimes something which is entered that there isn't a lot of real expertise in. And so at that point, We just work with people doing their best to be fair to the entrant. There is a certain amount of extra responsibility on the entrance part to teach as well as present when they do their presentation then. So that makes things perhaps a little bit harder. But by and large, when we're entering A&S, we are doing the things that we love anyway. And so most of us are pretty happy to geek out and teach our thing. For example, when Duchess Eleanor did her presentations this past year at A&S, I'm sure no one else in the room knew half as much about medieval vegetables as she did. So there was a definite teaching component to what she did, and she was able to convey that to her judges and to the populace on the Sunday morning and make it really clear what she was talking about, so that certainly I, as somebody in the populace listening to her talk, felt like I understood what she was talking about. And that was, I think, probably part of the decision that led to her being champion. Partly it's the judge's responsibility themselves, partly it's the entrant's responsibility to teach and create expertise. We just try to make sure we get the best people we can into those roles as much as possible. So in conclusion, we've talked today about a little bit about why Ontario developed these forms, how they work, and how to use them. If you're from Ontario, taking this class is required to be a judge at A&S or Bardic competitions, which use them in our kingdom, whether that's in summits or Thierry, in your own barony, or for the kingdom competitions. If you are joining us from elsewhere, I know some people have come to this class from other kingdoms. Hopefully it's been a good discussion of A&S judging in general. Other kingdoms are using our forms, either directly or as the basis for theirs. So this may be useful in using them as well. So I want to thank you all for being here. I thank their excellencies and the barony of Terra Pomaria for having us. And I'm Wulfstan Meistari. And if any further questions come up later, I mean, I'm happy to stick around and answer more questions or talk further. But if there are more questions later, please feel free to email me. It's at the bottom of your screen right now. It's in the chat. It will be on the YouTube link as well.
Thank you so much. This has been a very comprehensive class, and we really appreciate you taking the time to present it.
Of course. Glad to do it.
I think this will be very helpful for people who want to enter into the kingdom competitions.
I think so. I mean, I find that having judged was really a real help in doing that. I mean, I started student judging, I think, in 2008 at Kingdom Bardic, and I've been involved with our Thierry competitions in one way or another pretty much since then. So, and a little bit with Kingdom as well, of course.
And I think a lot of people feel like intimidation in entering into Kingdom A&S. And I think giving people an understanding of what they're going to be judged on, it dispels a lot of that intimidation mystery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the great reasons for using these forms at principality and regional and baronial levels. One thing I meant to mention and didn't earlier is how we scale that. At Kingdom A&S, a person who wins is probably going to be getting a lot of 4s and 5s. This year, they got a lot of 5s and 6s. There were amazing entries this year. I felt very much, as a past champion, I felt that Wayne's World, we're not worthy. We're not. When I saw it, they were fantastic. So yeah, 4s and 5s certainly is what we're expecting to see in a winning entry at Kingdom. A principality one, probably looking at around 4s, right? It's going to be good work, but not necessarily quite ready for that kingdom to be competitive at Kingdom yet. And that's still a good score at a principality level. In a baronial championship, if we're seeing somebody getting 3s, even a couple of 2s and some 4s, but if they're averaging around 3s, that's considered a good baronial level score, particularly for someone who's just entered their first time, right? We don't expect them to be getting the kind of level or doing the kind of work you'll see at Kingdom. They might be, and that's fantastic, but they probably won't, and that's okay too. So part of that demystifying and saying, no, it's okay, is if you're getting a 3 baronial championship, good for you. And when you go on to your regional, your principality championship, if you're getting 4s, hey, you're clearly growing and developing your craft. And then you go on to the kingdom and you're getting 5s, then again, you're making that next step, right? And you're staying competitive at each level. And I really do encourage people to although the runner-up my year, actually, that was her first competition, and she did phenomenally well right at Kingdom. She also has 2 master's degrees, but you know, for most of us, and I started at my Shire level, starting your local branch level, and then doing your region or principality, and then doing Kingdom is a good learning experience and a good kind of track. So
I would
Is-
also
Some of
say
us have master degrees that contribute nothing to A&S.
it's also true.
I would also say that as somebody who's starting to break into the arts and science world and also does better with more concrete information about how to proceed and what did and did not work. I did compete in the principality thing, and that was my first experience having received these forms. And it was great for being able to really see where I was and what I should do next. And I can see like going forward and like collecting these forms over the years, going like, okay, cool. It looks like I'm growing in that part, but maybe I'm slipping on that part. I need to shore that up a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they provide much better feedback than the previous ones did, and I think it's been pretty effective, especially if people add extra comments, which there's room to it into each section as well.
So many extra comments.
Pardon me 1 second, my son has a question. Yes, buddy. I don't remember what was it. Maybe in a few minutes. Let me finish this up first. Okay? we had talked the other day about going to Dairy Queen. My son's saying, "Can we go to Dairy Queen tonight?"
We
Wait,
understand.
hold on, we'll talk about it in a few minutes.
Ice cream, ice cream.
we have a wonderful peer down here in the summits, and
Yeah.
she explained the rubrics. You know, if you get like 1 or 2 and your other scores are decent, that's a good thing, because you know where you need to focus to improve your presentation.
Exactly. And what I find too is often, to some degree, like the 1 and the 2, there's quite a big gap. I mean, obviously a 0, there's nothing there at all, right? So that's pretty clear. But a 1 or a 2, there's quite a big gap in the language from a 1 to a 2. You know, and what we kind of looked at, we kind of keywords. And if you look across several forms, you'll notice the language is often very similar. And I've actually been going back through and editing and for the A&S minister and making sure that in places where we weren't as similar as we need to be, that it's more aligned. So it tends to go like a 0 is none, and then a 1 would be few, a 2 would be some, a 3 many, a 4 most, a 5 all, and then 6 is all, and also. You know, and so that's those kind of descriptors being vertically aligned that way really kind of helps with that. But absolutely, yeah, if you have a couple of low marks, that really just tells you what you're needing to work on. And the difference in some ways from a 3 to a 5 is smaller than the difference from, say, a 2 to a 3, right? So
Yeah, I can see that.
It's once you get into that 3 and a bit range, it's incremental steps. If you're wanting to, it's not there yet. I mean, you're on the way, but not there yet, right? And I think that's how it should be looked at, rather than in terms of like a failing grade sort of thing. Is a not there yet. And I always encourage judges, actually, especially with the lower scores, the 1s and the 2s, said if you're not sure about 2 marks, like I said, you know, round for yourself, round up in the entrance favor, but especially the 1s and 2s, because if that person's getting a lot of 1s and 2s, that can feel very negative and very discouraging. But 2s are less discouraging than 1s, right? Somebody, certainly at Kingdom level for sure, somebody who's getting a lot of 2s will not be winning the competition. If that's the predominant mark on their sheet, they are unlikely to be winning the competition, and that's fine. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't enter. It means that that's where they are right now, and we're getting assessed. But if that's the case, if it's kind of in between the 1 and the 2, it doesn't hurt anything to give them the 2 in the kind of well, what I say on our 5-point scales at school is a 2 is a fail and a 1 is a message, right? So we don't necessarily need to send that message. Occasionally you do. Sometimes it's like, you really didn't do this thing. And particularly, if it's a matter of, sometimes I've talked to somebody who's entered and they said, hey, what about this? And I'll say, well, here, you look at this book or this author, or look at this area of research. And sometimes that won't have appeared in their final product. And I'll often ask the questions like, so what can you tell me about other sources for this? And see how they respond, and why is that not in here? And if they respond well, that might still be a 2. And if they don't, like, well, I know you do this, so that might be that. But yeah, so I think often we can often give a 2 rather than a 1, unless it really needs to be clear that no, this is really something really lacking here. So
I think also
I try to be sympathetic to entrance, because I've been there so many times before.
I think also that the rubric needs to be used more widely at lower levels to breed familiarity.
I agree.
Principality Arts and Sciences was my first experience with it, and in prepping for it, I tried to look at the rubrics, but I was just wet. I mean, honestly, I looked at it and went, wall of text. I can't process this right now. I'm in panic mode anyway. I can't do this right now. Whereas I feel like if I had been kind of prepared for the amount of stuff in the rubric, which I greatly appreciate, there's so much, it's so broken down, so that you can get into everything. But if I had known that it was going to be that involved, I think I would have been a little bit more prepared to look at it.
Oh, for sure. No, I absolutely agree. And it can be challenging to do that, especially if you're doing 2 or 3 different things. I mean, for Kingdom A&S, you're looking at 3 different projects. Our principality, you're certainly doing 2. So it can be a lot to take in, and especially if you're wanting to decide, should I do process or object here, or should I do
I was kind of
pure
also
composition
or
or
in
original
the same competition, so
yeah.
A&S and Bardic at the same time.
You end up needing to read 5 sheets just to choose 3. It's it can be a lot. And that's one of the reasons I like teaching this class so much, is that I think anybody who's even thinking about entering should take this class, because knowing how these forms work is vital to choosing them properly, and will set you up for more success as a competitor. And if you choose not to compete, that's fine too. It's no bad thing to understand the process and to know what's going on there. And if that means we can then use you as a judge, all the better. And that's my A&S minister hat on right there.
Right?
Yeah. I entered a baronial level competition that used the forms, and part of entering was they had a page-long handout that consisted of, if your score seems low, don't worry. These are the kingdom level forms.
Yeah.
If you are getting 2s and 3s in a baronial contest, that's great.
Absolutely. We do that in Lionsgate too, actually. And we, it's funny because we have a number of not all, but mostly Laurels in Lionsgate who have judged Kingdom A&S for years and years, and reminding them each time, these are the kingdom forms. Don't feel bad if the person's getting a 2 or a 3. It's okay. It's different now, that sort of thing. And so, in a way, I mean, in terms of pure numbers, it doesn't mean that our baronial candidates are being judged, or our baronial entrants are being judged on the same scale as kingdom competitors. But it also means where you need to improve to get there, right? And we want to make that vertical alignment really clear and really easy to scaffold and kind of progress through.
Yeah, it seems like it provides a very nice mental visual for where you are. Rather than scoring all 5s at your baronial level and then going to a principality or a kingdom level, and all of a sudden you're like 1s and 2s. What the heck just happened?
I was a big fish in my small pond. Now I'm a little fish in the big pond.
The big one, yes.
Because it's a consistency between them.
Yeah, and I mean, And Ontier is a big pond. I mean, just travel alone. One of the reasons I didn't enter at Kingdom for so long was that Ontier is huge. And for many years, as I was getting established in my career, I was like, I don't have the money to travel. I had 4 kids. They're this only 3 of them are home now. One's grown up and moved out. But when they're all like 12 and under, I couldn't go to all these big events and in Portland or wherever with hotels and all these little kids. So it would be irresponsible to enter because I might win. I mean, that's not wasn't thinking, oh, well, of course I win. But if it happened, I mean, I say that as somebody who enters Coronet Tourney hoping to last through 2 rounds, and it's a double elimination, right? If I make round 3, wow.
We totally did that once. We better not win.
Well, yeah, but I know I'm not going to win, but every time my lady and I have a conversation. So even though I know I'm not gonna win, my lady and I have that conversation every time. Well, what if we do? Because it's part of what you swear to when you swear in. So
Yeah, we should have that conversation. What if I win?
With that, I'd like to remind that it is also still about the pageantry and the community building that both the principalities and baronial and Kingdom A&Ss are all about. And you don't have to enter the full gamut. You can enter one, or you can even just do a little display or something like that. So don't let that limit your entry into and participation in these things.
Absolutely. I mean, single entries are a great way to practice, to learn, to get to know the process. I did a single entry in Kingdom Bardic several years ago before I ever thought about entering Kingdom A&S. And I'm not sure, I think we do it at Kingdom level as well. Certainly in Theory, we will also take entries for feedback only. So if someone isn't interested in the scores and just wants to hear maybe on a work in progress, how am I doing? Where am I at? Where do I need to grow? What should I do next? Then that's a great way to do that, especially for people who are from the further flung branches that don't get a lot of, don't get a lot of maybe royal presence or don't get a lot of peer presence, that want to have that expert opinion on where they are.